Adrian Castellan threw $70 at mechanic Desmond Kane's feet and laughed when he said he could start the jet 12 specialists had already given up on. "Fix it and I'll pay you $10 million," she announced in front of the entire hangar crew. Desmond didn't answer. He opened an access panel, found a maintenance pin installed backward, and told the pilot to run the sequence. 5 minutes later, both engines roared. But Desmond wasn't looking at the check Adrian was already writing. He was looking at a man near the hangar wall who had just gone pale. Stay until the end because the $10 million bet was about to become the smallest thing at stake. It started that morning the way every morning started for Desmond, an invoice he couldn't afford to ignore and a truck that took 3 tries to turn over. He pulled into Castellan Regional at 7 a.m. and knew instantly something was wrong. Too many people moving too fast. And in the center of the hangar floor sat a $68 million jet, grounded with nobody being able to say why. Kane Aeroservice sat on the south edge of the airport property, close enough to catch Castellan's overflow work, far enough that nobody from the main building ever waved. Desmond had run the shop for 6 years since he left the Air Force with a folder of commendations and a daughter who needed someone home before dark. The commendations stayed in a box under his workbench. Zoe was 15 now, sharper than anyone gave her credit for, a trait she inherited from her father, whether she admitted it or not. 4 technicians, certification across 6 engine families, and a $58,000 invoice from a charter operator who kept promising the wire was coming. That unpaid invoice was the real reason Desmond drove to the main hangar that morning himself instead of sending a tech. He was delivering reconditioned valves, but he was also hoping for 5 minutes with the facilities coordinator that might turn into a contract, that might turn into breathing room. He never mentioned the money troubles to his crew, never complained about the coordinator who forgot to call back 3 times running. He signed delivery slips, drove home, helped Zoe with algebra she didn't actually need help with, and fell asleep some nights still smelling of jet fuel. People who met Desmond assumed the oil stains and the frayed collar told the whole story. They didn't ask what he'd flown, what he'd fixed under fire, or why his hands moved with the certainty of a man who once had seconds, not hours, to get something right. He never corrected them. Some things, he'd learned, you don't explain. You just do the work and let the work explain itself, eventually, to whoever's paying attention. Nobody in that hangar was paying attention yet. He heard it before he understood it. 40 seconds after walking through the side door, standing near the coordinator's desk with his delivery box still in his arms, Desmond caught the sound underneath the noise. The auxiliary intake valve closing a half-beat late. Small, almost nothing, the kind of thing that lived below the threshold of what a diagnostic screen would flag. But Desmond didn't listen to machines the way engineers read printouts. He listened the way a father listens for a change in his daughter's voice on the phone, for the thing that wasn't being said out loud. The lag meant the engine computer was receiving a signal it shouldn't have been receiving at that stage of startup. Not a software problem, a mechanical flag that the software was reading correctly. He filed it away and kept walking toward the side corridor. That's when Julian Marchetti stepped into his path. Broad-shouldered, weight settled on his back foot like a man perpetually bracing to retreat from a conversation. Julian looked at Desmond with the specific expression senior people reserve for contractors. Not hostile, just calibrated to remind a visitor where the boundary sat. Julian told him deliveries went through the receiving dock, that the hangar was restricted, and mechanics who worked on farm equipment didn't have standing to loiter near a Hallion. Desmond told him what he'd heard anyway, described the lag, offered the read in plain, unhurried words. Julian's face didn't move. Leave your package at the door, and your opinions with it. 12 feet away, Adrian Castellan was listening, and she was almost out of patience to spend. Adrian had 90 minutes to reach New York and close the Aurelius acquisition. 90 minutes was already optimistic, and every one of them was bleeding out on a hangar floor while 12 of the best technicians in the state stared at laptops that told them nothing was wrong. She turned toward Desmond with an assessment that took 3 seconds: the oil stain on his sleeve, the delivery box, the collar that's seen better years, and asked, with a precision that was almost polite, what exactly he thought he was doing in her hangar. Desmond told her what he'd told Julian. She studied him a moment longer. Then she reached into her blazer, pulled out a folded bill, and set $70 on top of his delivery box. "Get something to eat," she said, "and clear the restricted area." Desmond looked at the money. He looked at the jet. He set the box down, left the bill sitting on it, and said that if she gave him 5 minutes and access to the external panel, he could tell her whether the problem was what he thought it was. The 12 specialists paused. Julian started to object. Adrian held up a hand, and in that gesture was something close to dangerous amusement, the kind a person allows herself when she's decided to let a thing play out purely for the satisfaction of being right. "If you start that engine," she said, loud enough for the whole hangar to hear, "I'll pay you $10 million. Desmond asked her to say it again so everyone present could confirm they'd heard it. She repeated it without blinking. He picked up his tool bag. Behind the monitoring station, safety engineer Priya Okonkwo looked up from her screen, and for the first time that morning, she stopped watching the jet and started watching Desmond. There was nothing theatrical about Desmond's work. No drawn-out inspection, no pause for effect. He pulled the external access cover on the forward panel, checked each mechanical interlock in sequence, and found it on the third one. The number 2 intake isolation pin had been installed backward, a piece of hardware machined to fit only one direction, which meant the reversal had taken deliberate effort, not carelessness. In that orientation, it fed the engine computer a continuous signal claiming the high-pressure intake was still unsealed. The computer, doing exactly what it was built to do, refused to advance past the safety checkpoint. 12 people had spent 3 hours reading software logs for a fault that lived in a piece of hardware nobody had thought to check by hand. Desmond reseated the pin, verified the circuit with a handheld meter, and walked to the base of the boarding stairs. He told the pilot to run the sequence. The pilot, a composed man named Foster, who'd already tried 17 times and had no particular faith in an 18th, ran it anyway. The left engine caught, then the right, rising through its power bands with the deep, certain sound of a machine that had simply been waiting for someone to remove the thing in its way. The hangar went silent, except for the turbines. Adrian's face moved through surprise, calculation, something close to respect, and then a controlled return to composure that revealed more than it hid. Julian Marchetti had not moved. He stood exactly where he'd been standing when the engines lit, and something in his stillness was wrong in a way that Desmond didn't have a name for yet. Priya was already at her monitor, watching a readout, her relief curdling into something else. Adrian told her financial officer to begin the payment authorization. She looked at Desmond and said with a composure that it cost her something, that he'd earned what he was promised. Desmond didn't answer. He walked back to the aircraft and stood beside the left engine with his head slightly forward, eyes unfocused, the way people stand when they're not looking, only listening. Then he crossed to the right side and did the same. He turned to the cockpit and raised one flat hand. "Shut it down." Julian's voice cut across the hangar before Foster could respond, demanding to know what Desmond thought he was doing, suggesting in a tone stitched together too fast to be spontaneous that this was a stalling tactic to inflate his payout. Adrian's voice was cooler but carried the same weight. Her departure window was closing. She needed him off the aircraft. Desmond waited for the shutdown cycle to finish before he spoke. He walked to Priya's station and pointed at the display. The fuel pressure in the left feed system was cycling irregularly, not enough to trip an alarm, but in a rhythm that ran roughly 4 seconds off the baseline it was built to hold. He told her to pull the last 40 minutes of data log. She did. There was a 3-second gap in the recording at the 11-minute mark, a gap that shouldn't exist. Desmond told Adrian the aircraft had a startup fault because someone needed it to have one. And underneath that fault sat a second problem, one that wasn't built to ground the plane. It had been built to wait. Julian's response came within 60 seconds, the response of a man who'd already rehearsed it. He informed Adrian that components supplied by Kane Aero Service had been installed in the Halcyon 3 days ago. He suggested Desmond had accessed the aircraft during that service call, planted the fault that grounded it, then reappeared this morning to solve the problem he'd created himself, all to claim the $10 million. The logic was clean. The delivery was measured. The accusation landed with the weight of something that had been waiting for a moment to fall. Adrian looked at Desmond. Desmond looked at Julian with the expression of a man who'd heard a particular shape of lie before and recognized it instantly. She wasn't ready to declare either man credible without evidence. She asked security to hold Desmond in the crew lounge pending review. She told Julian nobody touches the data systems until it's done. Desmond didn't argue. He handed his phone, his tools, his signed delivery receipt, and walked to the lounge unescorted. Arguing against an accusation in the moment it's made is what guilty people do when they haven't prepared a defense. He had nothing to prepare. He simply waited. Priya ran the verification herself. The Kane Aero Service components were correctly certified, correctly installed, in a section of the aircraft entirely separate from the maintenance interlock where the fault had actually occurred. That access zone required a Castellan employee credential. It was physically outside anywhere a vendor delivery would ever reach. She pulled the electronic access log for the previous 72 hours. And found Desmond's vendor credential logged into the forward maintenance bay at 3:17 that morning, 2 days before he'd ever set foot back in that hangar. Adrian didn't come to the lounge herself. She sent Priya with the verification results and a straightforward offer. The company would honor the $10 million if Desmond signed a standard post-service confirmation stating the aircraft had been restored to airworthy condition. Desmond read the document with the same calm attention he gave every piece of paper a customer handed him. Then he set it down and told Priya he wasn't signing it because the aircraft wasn't airworthy, and putting his name on a document that said otherwise wasn't something he'd do for $10 million or any other number. Priya sat with that a moment. She'd spent enough time around people who said things like that while meaning something else. She needed to be sure he wasn't one of them. He wasn't. They talked for 40 minutes, longer than any formal briefing could have covered. Desmond explained the fuel pressure irregularity in terms she could cross-reference against her own notes. She told him she'd filed 3 anomaly reports over the past 4 months, each documenting a variance almost identical to what he'd found, and each one closed by Julian, attributed to sensor drift. Desmond needed not explain what that pattern meant. Meanwhile, Adrian's father, Emmerich Castellan, 79, the man who'd built the company out of a borrowed hangar in Amarillo, called her private line. His voice was flat and unhurried, the way it was always when something mattered. Ground the aircraft officially, seal the data, bring in an independent investigator before anyone else touches anything. She told him she needed to reach New York. He told her the person who'd benefit most from her missing that deadline wasn't a competitor. It was Julian, and it was time she stopped treating that as an abstract possibility.
Adrian sealed the aircraft anyway. Whatever she believed about Julian's motives, the gap in the monitoring log was real, the duplicated credential was real, and Desmond Kane refusing $10 million rather than sign a lie was the fact that deserved the most attention of all 3. Working with Priya through the afternoon, Desmond found the second layer within 2 hours, a modification buried in the flight management software, quietly reducing the threshold for fuel pressure alerts during cruise phase by a factor of 3, authorized from an executive-level login 4 days prior. The trail led to Julian, then further, to a consortium that had made a failed bid to buy out the very acquisition Adrian had spent 3 years building. Julian not just wanted the deal to collapse, he'd wanted deniability if it didn't. Julian was suspended within the week and referred for investigation. The technician who'd physically reversed the pin, a maintenance director drowning in a real estate debt Julian had quietly offered to erase, cooperated fully once confronted and confirmed the rest. The board once shown a simulation of what a real cruise phase fault looked like under the modified software, a 22-second delay in a situation where 22 seconds was the margin between a managed descent and catastrophe, voted unanimously to back Adrian and sever ties with Julian entirely. Adrian offered Desmond a title, safety director, full salary, the corner office. He turned it down. What the company needed wasn't a director who answered to the CEO. It needed an independent authority who answered to no one inside the building at all. He proposed something else, an arm's-length inspection center, funded by Castellan, governed by a charter that meant no executive could ever again override a technical finding. She agreed, and in agreeing, she accepted the one thing most people in her position never do, a permanent check on her own power, built by the man she'd once thrown $70 at and told to leave. She kept that bill, had it framed, hung it in the new center where anyone at the training table would see it unexplained, because the people who needed it explained hadn't been in the hangar that morning, and the frame wasn't where that story started anyway. Desmond kept the original shop running exactly as it was, same 4 techs, same worn workbench. Some things didn't need to get bigger to get better. On the morning the Halcyon finally flew, Adrian offered him the seat across from hers. He told her he had work. He drove Zoe to the fence line instead and stood there with his crew as the turbines climbed, found their register, and held. He didn't watch it go. He was already talking to his daughter.